Thank you. Pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about global governance and democracy, which you certainly heard a lot about, probably. There is today in the developed world, anyway, a prevailing zeitgeist, a dominant narrative, a set of core assumptions and presuppositions about how the world should work. That's a normative description, right? How it should work, it's not a empirical or descriptive how it does work. Well, the dominant paradigm, this sort of narrative, we could say, runs something like this. We need to build a new global architecture of transnational institutions, norms, and laws, and at the same time promote democratic values to advance a more prosperous, peaceful, and democratic world. So leading officials from Western and developed world governments talk in this manner. We share a political commitment to a rules-based globalization. We believe in a functioning system of global governance. Okay, so this narrative combines two ideas. The advance of global governance and global institutions and the advance of democratic values. It's presented as a harmonious whole with little tension between them, sort of harmoniously. Now I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes examining what I think is wrong with this narrative and presenting a counter-narrative that I believe is more likely to achieve a prosperous, peaceful, and democratic world. I'm going to suggest that the goals of this symposium, the goals of cultural diplomacy, building cultural bridges, strengthening cross-cultural relationships for the benefit of improving international relations and international security, the whole goals of cultural diplomacy, these goals are not well served by understanding the world through the lens of the narrative of global governance, at least as it's seen today. The dominant narrative tells us that the architecture of global governance and liberal democracy are complementary. I will argue that they're often contradictory. Let's start with a question. How many of you have heard the phrase, global problems require global solutions? Raise your hand if you've ever heard that phrase. Global problems require global solutions. That's just about everybody. So what are some of the global problems then? World poverty, we could say, is a problem. The lack of social mobility, violence, war and peace, violations of human rights, and so on. Let's take the economic issue. Many people in the world are living in sub-poverty conditions today. Different solutions are proposed. But in all cases, what these solutions are disputed. People argue about these solutions. The solutions are, of course, political, aren't they? A social democratic approach would be one that emphasizes Keynesian economics, government programs, higher taxes on some types of capital. That's quite different from, say, a Reagan-Thatcher approach that emphasizes the role of free markets and deregulation of some of the government's economic authority. So it depends on your point of view on how we handle the problem of global poverty. Now I'm presuming everyone in this room, myself included, believes in sort of a rules-based globalization. But it depends upon what the rules are and who has the right to make the rules. We hear a lot about global rules. Well, who makes them? What are they? The single most important question in world government, world politics, just two words: who decides? Who decides what kind of economic policy we should live under? Who decides what our national security policy is? Who decides what our immigration policy is? Who decides what are and what are not human rights? I was very interested. I listened to Professor Pumar's talk just in the last session. It was very interesting. And he told the story of people coming here. One was Mr. Vargas, who came from the Philippines, and so on, coming from the American dream. Well, interesting question, and probably a core. When you say what is democracy, what do we mean by liberal democracy? To what extent does democracy mean government by consent of the governed? Who would agree with that sort of a point of democracy? That's a key part of it then, government by consent of the governed. Well, Mr. Vargas has his dream, he's coming here, but he's here without the consent of the government. Many people have arrived without the consent of the government. So that's what the debate is about today. It's the number of folks that we have, and there are rules. So some people may have their certain circumstances, but people can come here with or without consent. So these are some of the more, when we start digging a little deeper into some of these issues, I think this is what we find. So who governs? Who decides? This is the oldest question in politics. It goes back to Plato and Aristotle. They wrote about this question. Who should make these decisions? They say liberal democracy has one set of answers. Democracy, demos, people, rule of the people, consent, but governed by consent of the governed, means self-government. Of course, it doesn't mean that 51% of the people, ram their views down the throats of the other 49%. There are certain, government is also limited. So we not only have democracy, we have liberty. Together they make liberal democracy. So liberal democracy is a compound system. It's not just one system of majoritarian rule. It's a system of liberal democracy. Liberty and democracy together. Government can do these things that people agree on, but certain things are limited. Certain things the government can't do. Come in your house, break it down, arrest you for no reason. So there's limited, they're limited. So I'm suggesting a counter-narrative to the global governance paradigm. I'm suggesting that when you look at the world, we shouldn't simply think of what we're seeing today in global governance. We should see the world today instead as the developed world I'm talking about here, because in some of the other, in the developing world, there's still a struggle of getting to liberal democracy. But in the world that has established it, we have an arena really of ideological competition between two different agendas. One is democratic sovereignty, liberal democracy through a nation state, and the other is global governance and supranational governance. And the EU, the European Union, is partly a supranational. That's a different way of deciding things, of making decisions. Decisions are not made necessarily by national parliaments, but they're made by, in some cases, the European Commission, or the European Council, or the European Parliament can veto things, but they really can't propose things. So there's two different ideas in the world, in the developed world today. The world of democratic sovereignty, the world of global governance. I've written a book. In Washington, you're supposed to promote your book, so I'm going to promote this one. It's called Sovereignty or Submission. There's an American title to it. I have a chapter on the European Union. I have a chapter on what's going on in Israel. And it's a world affair. So I'm saying that is a conflict. It's available on Amazon, obviously. That's the conflict between, in the developed world, between democratic sovereignty and global governance. Now, in this book and in my arguments that I've been making for the last couple of years, I distinguish between just pure national sovereignty and democratic sovereignty. National sovereignty would apply in North Korea or Burma, or authoritarian states could be sovereign. We know about Westphalian sovereignty. You've heard that in international relations from the Treaty of Westphalia. It means the state is sovereign. Sovereignty means, the sovereign, the king, the queen, the state is sovereign. So I came up with a title, instead of Westphalian sovereignty, I said I'm more interested in Philadelphian sovereignty. It rhymes, Philadelphian, Westphalian. But Philadelphian, I'm thinking here of the American Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. The beginning of the American Constitution says, "We the people of the United States." So the idea, at least, is that the people are sovereign, not the state, but the people. So that is Philadelphian sovereignty as opposed to Westphalian sovereignty. So I make that distinction in my book and in the recent arguments that I've been giving the last couple of years. So how do we define the other theory, global governance? We hear a lot about that. Well, Abraham Lincoln defined sovereignty as a political community without a political superior, nobody above it. The leading theorists of global governance define democratic states as subordinate beneath the institutions of global governance. Give an example. Anne Marie Slaughter was she's been a leading theorist of global governance. She was head of the United States State Department Office of Policy and Planning. That's the in-house think tank, a very important office. That's the one that George Kennan headed once. You know about the Cold War history. Slaughter said that nations should cede sovereign authority to supranational institutions and transnational networks. Well, that's what they've done in Europe. They've ceded authority to the European Commission or the European Court of Human Rights, various pan-European institutions that are above the nation state. Well, Slaughter said we can do this on a global basis, and she maintains that the supranational institutions and networks can perform, this is a direct quote, can perform many of the functions of a world government, legislation, administration, adjudication, without the form, thereby creating an effective global rule of law. So if we go back to Abraham Lincoln's formulation of sovereignty, the global governance agenda, there would be a political superior. Some global institutions and global law would be superior. But, again, getting back to the most important question, who decides? Who decides when global institutions and laws are superior to democratic nation states? Now, in my argument, I'm not rejecting internationalism or international cooperation. I'm presenting a counter-narrative that is robustly internationalist. It's just done by democratic states. What I'm criticizing here is a non-democratic global overreach, and that should be clear in a few minutes. Obviously, nation states enter many treaties and international agreements for their mutual benefit, in which they agree to limit sovereignty. They mostly adhere to international law in most cases. But international law, including customary international law, is built on the principle of state consent. States have to agree. The problem arises when democratic consent is missing. So I'm going to give you two examples before we get to the question period. Two examples of where there are problems in the global governance arguments. Let's examine an institution probably many people here in the room think is probably a very good institution, the International Criminal Court. Let's examine that in the context of democratic values, in the context of human rights, and the context of democratic accountability. The International Criminal Court, the ICC, was established as a permanent global court to deal with the most egregious international crimes, including genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. This was sort of the idea after Nuremberg. Well, we need sort of, Nuremberg was just the Allies, the four victorious powers in World War II, making the decisions. Well, the idea is, wouldn't it be better to have a global court? So they created this court. More than 100 countries are members of the Rome Statute that established the ICC. But leading democracies have refused to join. Yeah, the United States is one, but the world's largest democracy, India, is not a member. The world's largest Muslim democracy, Indonesia, is not a member. Israel is not a member. El Salvador, some other countries are not, and they're objecting on the grounds of what I might call democratic sovereignty. Now let's take a hypothetical case. Let's take the world's largest democracy, India. Let's say this is very possible, that could happen. Indian troops are on a peacekeeping mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Democratic Republic of Congo is a member of the ICC. And war crimes are alleged to have been committed by Indian soldiers. Now, even though India is not a party to the ICC, Congo is, so they could be some claim of jurisdiction. Now, what would happen, the question of subsidiarity, some of you have heard this term before, would kick in for subsidiarity. And in ICC rules, this is called complementarity. It means, in this particular case, India could say, okay, these soldiers, our soldiers are charged with war crimes. We're going to try these Indian soldiers in an Indian court. Okay, so they're tried in an Indian court. Let's say they're acquitted. At that point, the ICC had said, well, there was something fishy about this trial, we think, even though you have a democratic legal system. If the party is unwilling or unable to conduct a legitimate trial, then the ICC can take over if the ICC decides. So in this case, the ICC could say, well, we think you were unwilling to have a regular trial, so we're taking over in this case. This is according to the ICC rules. It would determine the global prosecutor, the ICC prosecutor could ask a pre-trial chamber of the ICC, and they would rule on a 2-to-1 vote to take this case. So in this case we have, these are according to the rules of the ICC. The ICC is an autonomous supranational institution of global governance, so they would claim legal authority over the citizens of a democratic nation state, in this case India, without the consent of that state. Now there's a further problem. according to Freedom House, 37% of the nations that belong to the International Criminal Court are not completely free societies. So you could have, in this case, judges from dictatorships such as Chad, Congo, Tajikistan, some other countries that are members, and illiberal, partly free countries. I would list Venezuela, that's listed by Freedom House. Okay, the judges from those countries could sit in judgment over the citizens of functioning democracies such as Israel, Indonesia, India, and El Salvador. Now, state consent has always been a core principle of international law. Hence, the rules, the very rules of the International Criminal Court, which almost every European country is a member, are themselves in violation of the international law, and I would say they're a front then to democratic government. Now, there's another issue, though. What is a war crime? What constitutes a war crime? Well, that's in dispute. The dominant legal opinion of the International Criminal Court is that the 1977 additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention, we've all heard about the Geneva Conventions, World War II, the Red Cross delivers packages and so on. Well, in 1977, they added a bunch of stipulations to the Geneva Conventions, additional Protocol 1. One example under additional Protocol 1 is a belligerent, we'll say there's a war going on. A belligerent is required to warn the other side before an air attack if there are civilians in the area, so the civilians can leave the area. So we're going to warn the other side. So in World War II, you'd be calling up Berlin saying an air attack is coming, you better clear your civilians out of the way. Well, obviously, if a combatant warns the other side, they're tipping off the other side's air defenses, putting their own airmen at risk. But if a combatant doesn't do this, they're committing a possible war crime according to the current International Criminal Court definition. Now remember, the International Criminal Court was established to deal with the most egregious crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. The Nuremberg trials are often evoked. Well, many nations, including many democracies, do not adhere to this definition, to the ICC Protocol 1's definition of war crimes, because they know the difference between Nuremberg, between the Holocaust, and warning an enemy before an air raid. There is a difference between that. So my critique of the International Criminal Court is not that it's a good idea in principle, but it's difficult to achieve in practice. I'm saying it's a bad idea in practice. Now, if the United States did not exist as a nation, the United States, I took other examples, I didn't mention the United States. If they didn't exist as a nation state, the principles of the ICC would still be problematic because they're at odds with the concept of government by consent of the governed. I'm going to give you one more example, because that was a sort of a security issue. I'm going to give you sort of a domestic policy example before we go to questions. Now, various human rights treaties have been developed by the UN since the formation of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Most people know about that. It was created under the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt right after World War II. Now, one of the treaties that was created, there were many different areas, but one of the, based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is the UN Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW Treaty. Now, I'm a member of the International Society for International Law, so I had a conversation. This is like right before I wrote the book, like 3 years ago. I had a conversation with a member of the CEDAW, the UN Women's Treaty Monitoring Committee of the UN. So her job, she was on this committee that goes around the world for countries that sign the UN treaty and see if they're in compliance, and they have questions, and they're checking on what governments are doing to be in compliance with the CEDAW treaty, the Women's Treaty. So I was talking to her, and I said, yes, I said, I remember the case in 1997 where the CEDAW report on Slovenia complained that in Slovenia only 30% of women had their children in daycare centers. So this was a problem for CEDAW. So I said, well, why was that an issue? I said, for one thing, the government that was just elected, this is 97, it was like a Christian democratic government, that was part of their platform. We're going to be elected, we're going to have the benefits for home-stayed parents, usually women. And that's going to be part of our policy. They were elected, they did this. So I said, isn't this what happens in free society? So the UN representative said, no, this basically what this policy does is reinforces old stereotypes. And in the UN committee's view, it deprives children of the educational and social opportunities that would be available in the daycare center. So they would be deprived of these centers. So I went through, there was election. I said you could have a new election, which actually happened then in Slovenia. You had a social democratic government come in, and they changed the daycare policies. So isn't this, in other words, how these things work in a free society? Isn't this a question of policy? Isn't a question of daycare centers in Slovenia a question that a democratically elected, a democracy can decide for itself, and a democratic parliament can decide, or individuals can make these decisions? And the CEDAW monitor said, who's a big advocate, this is Global Governance in Action, said, no, this was not a policy issue. This is a matter of universal human rights. Slovenia's policy on stay-at-home parents was discriminatory and hurt women's rights. In this case, global norms trump legislation from a democratically elected parliament. So I contend this is not what Eleanor Roosevelt had in mind with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was agreed to and signed. This wasn't really what people had in mind when they signed the CEDAW Treaty in Beijing, well, it was in the 70s now. Today, we have a bloated definition of human rights that is crowding out democratic decision-making. Now, are these policies or are they rights? Which in this case, it's outside of the democratic arena. Now, again, as with all these global problems we're discussing, including security problems or domestic policy problems, these are problems about which intelligent people can disagree. What exactly constitutes women's rights or human rights? And what system should make these determinations? Should it be a liberal democracy within a nation state, or should it be global governance? Or, since we have a lot of Europeans here, should it be decided by the European Court of Human Rights? When I was in Britain a couple years ago, there was a big question. Britain tried to extradite what they considered terrorists. They wanted to send them out of the country. But the case went before the Strasbourg Court, which is not an EU court, as you know. But it's a member of the Council of Europe, or the European Council of Human Rights. And they said, well, you can't deport these terrorists, or what you consider terrorists, because it's a question of human rights. They could go back to Jordan. They might be in danger in Jordan. The British Parliament passed a law saying we are going to deport them. So there was a question of who decides here. Who decides national security policy in Britain? Is it decided by the British Parliament, elected by the British people? Or is it decided by judges of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, who don't have to live with the consequences of their decisions? So again, we always get back to the question of who decides. Who decides the family laws in Slovenia, or national security issues in Britain? It is a supranational institution or a democratically elected legislator. The devil is always in the details. Now, a leading American professor, I won't mention his name, but a leading American professor of international relations has advocated that human rights decisions are best made by what he called epistemological communities. Epistemological means knowledge base, so people that have the knowledge. So in this case, they should make the decision on human rights. So that would be global legal experts, basically, should have this knowledge. Global legal experts, not bound by the principles of democratic consent. So this is ruled by an oligarchy. It's not ruled by a democracy, it's ruled by an oligarchy. So I suggest to you, the advocates of the global governance, and that includes the European Union, have not yet solved the democracy deficit. As Joschka Fischer himself said, we haven't solved the democracy deficit problem. Now, the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy is conducting a series of symposia in 2014 across the globe on issues such as promotion of world peace, through interfaith dialogue, international law, sustainable development, youth empowerment, women's rights, human rights, peace building through conflict resolution. All of these issues will not be discussed in a vacuum. They will be discussed within an overarching narrative. I suggest to you a framework that examines two competing visions, two competing narratives. of international progress, how to achieve international progress. On the one hand, democratic sovereignty, democratic nation states working together. On the other hand, global governance, where you have the supranational institutions. This is two different ways of choosing. This competition, I'm suggesting, I think is a better way of getting at what you're all trying to get at here. And I think it addresses what the global governance narrative fails to seriously address, which is their own inherent contradictions. And I'll stop there. Yes, cultural diplomacy obviously will always have a role. The ideas are not going to be, we have an internet, we have ideas. The ideas are going to go worldwide. And we obviously draw ideas from everywhere in the world. So of course it will have a role. My argument is that the actual decision making should be made by democratically within a democratic nation state. So you certainly could draw on ideas from everywhere. And that's happening, so there's no question that's going to happen. I mean, in fact, when these treaties come up, the United States usually does not accept treaties as a general rule. It's for a couple of reasons. One, it's very hard to get a treaty through because you need 2/3 of the Senate. And the other question is the United States takes these treaties very, very seriously. So I think more than some other countries. So if we actually sign the treaty, then the laws would go into effect. We're also a very litigious society. We have a lot of lawsuits. So there will be all kinds of lawsuits if these treaties were actually signed and go into effect. That's what the American Bar Association, which is the leading legal institution in the United States, says, well, if we pass the CEDAW Treaty, the Women's Treaty, then these are the 400 things that would have to happen. And it's a whole series of lawsuits that they have prepared. So actually that's why the treaty probably did not pass. Because people say, well, we'd rather do this by domestic legislation. But your question, yes, I agree, there will be global, that's inevitable anyway. What I'm arguing, though, is it should not trump democratic decision making. And in the end, these decisions should be made by the parliament in these countries or the Congress of the United States or whatever through the democratic process. I mean, daycare policy in Slovenia should be set by the Slovenian parliament, not by the UN CEDAW committee. It's true they don't set it, but they're sort of exerting pressure. And what they're trying to do is take an issue outside of the democratic arena and put it into the rights. There's rights over here. There's a few rights. You know, the right of that you can't have the police can't break in your house. You have the right of to present evidence, and there's certain rights that government cannot do, and there's all these policies that government can pass. What's happening today, and what's happened in a lot of these UN treaties, is you're taking areas outside of outside of policy, where it's in the democratic arena. This is the arena of democracy. You're taking outside of democracy and putting it into rights, where only lawyers or judges deal with it. So we're actually shrinking the democratic space. So I'm arguing sort of counterintuitively, I'm sure, for this kind of audience. You usually don't hear this kind of argument. But things like the CEDAW Treaty or the treaty on even the rights of the child or the rights of the disabled, they all sound great in practice. But what they're doing in actuality is shrinking the space of democracy and moving this space from the democratic space where you can debate policy and say yes or no, whatever that policy is, and putting it into a legal area of rights where only judges decide. And I have a whole chapter in here sort of criticizing the European Union. Because I think what the European Union does is judicialize a lot of areas that should be policy questions, and they sort of take it out of policy and say, no, this is a matter for, the laws of for directives from the European Commission, or this is a question for the European Court of European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, or it's actually the European Council. It could be the European Court of Human Rights, which is a council issue. So we're taking issue after issue is taken out of, let's take a very controversial issue like abortion, for example. Well, you can either decide that democratically, or that could be a question of rights, however you want to determine it. There's both sides of this argument. Say, well, this is a right. This is a right to life. This is a right, or it's a human right. Women can do what they want, or the child is human. And this issue is put in the area of rights, so it's a legal issue, or is it in the democratic question? You can have all kinds of issues. On the questions of deporting terrorists, the same thing. Right, well, that's why I have a chapter, and why I tried to explain earlier that I'm in favor of democratic sovereignty, that's sort of a phony, it's not democratic accountability. I'm in favor of democratic sovereignty, countries with democracies that have democratic accountability. There's no democratic ability in North Korea or some of these places. I agree that legally that'd be a hard thing to establish in international law, but I'm making the argument that they're not legitimate. A country like North Korea would not have a legitimate claim to sovereignty because the people there are not sovereign. So that's why I'm making the argument in favor of Philadelphian sovereignty rather than technical Westphalian sovereignty. I make that argument in the book.
Well, I guess in terms of practical.
In practical, it's difficult. I agree. Well, we do have a United UN Security Council. Now, the International Criminal Court was founded, tried to deliberately bypass the Security Council. So this could have all been done through the Security Council, which actions of the Security Council are technically international law. So that could have been done this way. The people that formed the ICC in the Rome Treaty deliberately bypassed the Security Council. So North Korea can be condemned by the Security Council. We have a mechanism now. Well, I think what I argued is there should not be global, decisions should not be necessarily made at a broad global level, centralized level. The best kind of decision making is made at the local level, I think, is what I was arguing. And that may include, the nation state as well, but usually it's people closest to the problem that can come up with the right decision. That's not always the case. We have the problem of there might be an authoritarian government. We're talking about North Korea in some cases. So these people may not be free, but if the people are free, I think they can make their own decisions. That was the point I was trying to make with Slovenia. I think the case could be made probably by an individual family in Slovenia. The parliament can make a decision, but also the father and mother, Slovenian fathers and mother, could make their own decision about whether they want to send a child to a daycare center or whether they want to raise that child at home. That's actually a decision that could be made at the family level. You don't need an international decision-making process. So I'm arguing against those type of international decision-making. I'm in favor of international institutions where people learn, they get, and the type of diplomacy you're talking about where we can learn from others and have cooperation. But the actual decision-making in a free society should be made as close to the source as possible. So I agree with you, I guess, that the West should not necessarily be telling everybody what to do. We can set the United States and other countries can set an example. This is when you're free to follow or not follow. If you're actually free, a place like North Korea is not free. So I'm trying to answer your question. I don't know if that answers it. It was sort of difficult to follow in a way. Yeah, but I think I answered it. I prefer decision making at the local level if the people are free. There shouldn't be dictation from the rich powers. They can set an example. I don't think the G20 should necessarily dictate. In fact, a good part of my discussion was a critique of people talking about the type of discussions that come out of Davos, I think are one-sided. These are people talking about global governance. I think they forget about democracy. They forget about local governments. You have at a range of Indonesia is a democratic country. They can come up with their own decisions. That's not in the West. Philippines is pretty much democratic. So there's places that can make those decisions. And again, I want to press the envelope. That's why I a little bit that's why I was interested in the professor before me, because everybody say, well, this is great. Vargas comes to the country, people can come, it's wonderful. But he came here without the consent of the government. So that's an issue. That's why a lot of people are upset. Because we do have rule of law, and you're supposed to come here. We sort of make the determination of who can immigrate. That's the basis of a democratic country, is they make those decisions, who can immigrate and who can't immigrate. So that's the other side of the coin. I wanted to make sure that was heard here, because we only heard one side of the argument in the earlier discussion. So I wanted to make sure that was very clear, I talk about sovereignty, I talk about government by consent. Part of that is that a democracy has the right to determine its own immigration policy. So if people are coming here without consent, and that is a challenge to the democratic regime. The same thing would occur in Europe. So I wanted to make that clear too. So I was hoping I answered your question as best I could. There are other questions.
No,
Yes.
just one comment, but how do you see this for Europe? Because in Europe, countries cannot come up anymore with their own immigration policies because it affects the other countries as well.
Right. Well, you have to. I'm not a European, so you can determine what
No, I know.
your own
but
policy.
I just want to know your
But I do
opinion.
see there are people in Europe have different ideas. You had even the British government is Prime Minister Cameron is talking about repatriating powers back from. He wants to repatriate, taking powers back from the European Commission. He wants to take the immigration power back to Britain. He said this, and you just saw the last election. The United Kingdom Independence Party was first. They got 27% of the vote, and that was their main platform, was taking these powers back. Now, so that was a good part of the European election that you just had. A lot of these people who were saying this won a lot of votes, and they aren't all bad guys. Some are bad guys. They all aren't. You have in Germany, you have the Alternative for Deutschland, which looks like they're mainly professors.
Yeah, and
Doesn't look like they're neo-Nazis or anything. They look like they're mainly academics who are making a case that the euro is not the best situation for Germany, and that hasn't been particularly good for Germany. Now it may be good for German exports, but and obviously the Greeks are arguing that the euro was not particularly good for Greece. So you have people on both ends. So I think again, it's not up to me. You'll have to make your own decision. But I would be sympathetic to the people in Europe who are talking about democratic sovereignty and who are making. I met Daniel Hannan when I was there. He's a member of the European Parliament for the British Conservative Party, and he's arguing in favor of more power going back to nation states. That would there's certainly a good, have free trade and many other things. But on the other hand, immigration policy, he's arguing, could be run by nation states, and even trucking rules and so on. I mean, countries, there's minute laws they're getting. Every time I go to Britain, they're complaining about all these laws they're getting from the European Commission on trucking, on weights and measures. I mean, the size of just about everything, size of bananas or whatever it is. It's probably not necessary. That's just my view. I mean, I'm not a European. You people can have your own views. But I would be sympathetic to the people who are trying to, and this I don't think was the original idea, or at least some of the people in Europe. The original Treaty of Rome was a treaty supposedly of sovereign states. Well, at the same time, they're supposed to work for ever closer union, but ever closer union in the end is eliminating these sovereign states. So Joschka Fischer has had this big famous speech he gave in Berlin, at Humboldt University in Berlin, where he said, well, what we need then is a democratic Europe, a European Parliament. Okay, that would be a possibility if you have this European identity you're talking about. I'm not sure that's there. I think people in France probably consider themselves French, but rather than being Europeans, I think the last election showed that. So are you really consider yourself a European, or do you consider yourself French or Dutch? The Germans have a particular problem, but most of the other people think of national identity first. Some in Spain, of course, think they're Catalonians first. So you have all these competing identities. Go ahead.
Maybe, no,
Right. Well, there's a difference between immigration and migration.
Well,
Migration, going to work for a while, that's fine. Immigration means you're staying permanently, you become a citizen, you change loyalties and so on. So those are different things. Now, if the people agreed in Britain that, yeah, we agree there should be open migration, that's one thing. But again, I'm not I'm saying we should have a process of people agreeing. So if you had a vote in Britain and most people said, yes, we favor this idea of open immigration, all jobs should be open. If they agree with that, fine. It doesn't look like they agree with that right now. Also in France and these other countries. But if they agree with them, that's fine. That's democracy.
I think it's also a generational conflict.
That could be. Well, then it might change at some point. Yeah. Right. 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 But in the end, whether it's generational or what generation's in charge, whatever's the democratic process in that country, I'm arguing, should play itself out. That's the core of my argument. Yeah, I got the question. Right. Well, it both could be. During my talk, I just explained how global governance could be manipulated by a UN monitoring committee basically making decisions that should be made at the local level. I also explained how a country such as India doesn't have basically the right to defend itself, or a country such as Britain doesn't have the right to its own security policy if these global courts go into effect. So this can work both ways. You'll have to have, I don't know if you live in Virginia or wherever you vote, you'll have to let the democratic process play out. There would be better possibility of both democracy and liberty playing itself out. In most cases, there'd be a better possibility if this is done at the local level than done at the local level, than done at the global level. Global level, you have one decision, that's it. Local level, you have many different decisions. This is the old argument against sort of world government. Well, Einstein argued that the way to achieve peace is to have, after World War II, people were talking about world government. Nobody does that anymore. Now you're talking about global government. But the idea was, how do we have a world government to achieve world peace, was basically the idea. We'll have a world government that has control of nuclear weapons and so on. Of course, this didn't happen with the Cold War and so on. But the argument was then we need a world government. And the counter-argument, a couple philosophers argued this, and the counter-argument was, what if the world government became a tyranny? Where could you go? If you were a political refugee, where could you go? If you just had one authority. At least with diversity, I'm talking about diversity here, with diversity in terms of different forms of government, you didn't have, at least you could, if you weren't free, you could get out, you could leave a tyranny. But if there was one government, one law, one rule, you couldn't get away from it. So I'd rather take my chances on having diverse nation states, and that's the best argument I can give, that the chances of manipulation will be much greater under a centralized authority.
Okay.
So I'm talking about liberal democracy. We're talking more about liberty here, actually, than democracy, but a liberal democracy. You're saying, what should the educational policy be? Countries can determine their own educational policy. I would tend to agree with you that I would certainly want to study the history of the 20th century is to study the history of fascism, of Marxism, of National Socialism. We certainly should, as you're saying, studying all religions and so on. Yes, I would favor as broad an education as possible. I think that's what you're asking. Should students, would it be good if students throughout studied all of these things? The answer is, I think, at least my view would be yes. I think an open education system in which all of these things were certainly there shouldn't be things that should not be taught. So yeah, I would think they should be taught, and students should have a wide exposure to all of these ideas. If that's in the educational system, that would be a preferable education system. They would also be somewhat inoculated. If they've never heard some of these ideas, then they may be open to something. I guess I think at this point, that we'd all be better off, even since Germany sometimes was so worried about teaching certain things that they sort of narrowed the curriculum. But I think if you expose students to all aspects, that it's probably a better system. So essentially, I think I'm agreeing with what you're suggesting here.